The morning light from Nexus Station's artificial sun filled the classroom through massive windows that showed the endless stars beyond. Professor Veltar moved between the rows of students with his usual proud walk. His 4 eyes looked at each student as he passed them. The tall alien had purple skin that seemed to shine under the lights. His long fingers held a teaching device that projected images in the air above the students' heads. Dae-ho Kim sat in the back corner of the room where he always sat. He wore simple clothes from Earth, a plain blue shirt and dark pants that looked very different from the fancy uniforms most other students wore. His black hair was a bit messy, and his eyes were focused on the notebook in front of him instead of the professor. While other students sat up straight and ready to listen, Dae-ho drew pictures in his notebook with a simple pencil. The classroom held students from many different worlds. There were tall blue beings with extra arms, small furry creatures with big eyes, and others that looked like walking plants. They all came from advanced worlds that had traveled between stars for hundreds or thousands of years. Then there were the humans, only 3 of them in a class of 30 students. So Young Park sat near the front. She always took careful notes and asked good questions. Her neat handwriting filled page after page as she tried to learn everything she could. Next to her sat Min-ho Lee, who seemed nervous and kept looking around at the alien students. Both of them had come to Nexus Station to study and represent their planet well. But Dae-ho was different. He had been there for 3 weeks and still acted like he did not want to be there. He never asked questions, rarely spoke to other students, and spent most of his time drawing strange pictures or writing numbers that no one else could understand. The other students whispered about him sometimes. They said he was lazy or maybe not very smart. Professor Veltar had noticed Dae-ho from the first day. The human annoyed him with his lack of interest and respect. Today, Veltar planned to teach about primitive species integration protocols, basically how to deal with less advanced races who wanted to join the galactic community. It was perfect timing to make an example of the bored human student. Veltar pressed a button on his device and the air above the students filled with pictures of different planets and their technology. He showed ships that could travel faster than light, cities that floated in space, and machines that could change matter itself. The alien students looked impressed, even though they had seen such things before. Students, today we will learn about the proper ways to help primitive species, Veltar said in his deep voice. The translator devices everyone wore made his words clear in their own languages. Some races develop much slower than others. They need guidance and patience as they slowly learn to catch up with the rest of us. Several students nodded and took notes. Veltar walked closer to where the humans sat. So Young looked uncomfortable and Min-ho shifted in his seat. But Dae-ho kept drawing in his notebook like nothing was happening. For example, Veltar continued, consider the humans. They have only recently begun to leave their home planet. They still use very basic technology. Their fastest ships burn chemicals to move through space. Can you imagine? Chemical rockets. In an age of quantum drives and space-time manipulation. Some students made sounds that meant they were surprised or amused. Others looked at the 3 humans with what might have been pity. Veltar felt pleased with how his lesson was going. Dae-ho finally looked up from his notebook. His dark eyes met Veltar's gaze for a moment. Then he returned to his work without saying anything. This made Veltar even more determined to make his point. The humans have been trying to explore space for less than 100 of their years. Veltar went on. In that time, they have managed to land on their own moon and send a few small machines to nearby planets. Very impressive for such a young species, of course, but it shows how far they have to go. Veltar pulled up images of Earth and its moon, then pictures of human spacecraft. The ships looked small and simple compared to the sleek vessels other species used. The chemical rockets seemed almost silly next to ships that could fold space and appear instantly anywhere in the galaxy. Now, students, this is not meant to insult our human classmates, Veltar said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Every species develops at its own pace. The humans are doing quite well for their level. They show promise and may someday join us as true space-traveling people. Dae-ho had finished whatever he was drawing and now seemed to be writing equations. His pencil moved quickly across the paper as he wrote numbers and symbols. Occasionally he would pause, look up at nothing in particular, do some thinking, then continue writing. So Young and Minho looked very uncomfortable now. They knew what Veltar was doing but did not know how to respond. Speaking up might make things worse, but sitting quietly felt wrong too. Other students were starting to stare at them and whisper among themselves. Veltar decided it was time to make his point, more directly. He walked over to stand right next to Daeho's desk. The human was so focused on his work that he did not seem to notice the large alien professor looking down at him. "Mr. Kim," Veltar said loudly, "perhaps you would like to share with the class what you find more interesting than our discussion of interstellar technology." Several students turned to look. Some seemed excited to see what would happen. Others looked worried. The room became very quiet except for the soft humming of the station's life support systems. Daeho looked up slowly. He did not seem angry or embarrassed, just mildly curious about why he was being interrupted. His calm reaction surprised Veltar, who had expected the human to be nervous or ashamed. "I was just working on some calculations," Daeho said in a quiet voice. "Nothing important." "Calculations?" Veltar's voice grew louder. What sort of calculations could a human possibly be working on in a class about advanced space technology? Daeho glanced down at his notebook, then back up at the professor. "Just some ideas about space travel. Sorry if I was not paying attention." This response made Veltar even more confident. The human was admitting he had not been listening, which proved Veltar's point about primitive species being unable to keep up with advanced learning. "Ideas about space travel?" Veltar repeated, making sure his voice carried to all the students. "How fascinating. I am sure the class would love to hear a human's thoughts on a subject your species has barely begun to explore." The sarcasm in Veltar's voice was clear to everyone. Some alien students made soft sounds that meant they found this funny. Others looked uncomfortable with how the professor was treating the human student. Daeho closed his notebook and put his pencil away. He looked around the room at all the faces watching him, then back at Professor Veltar. His expression remained calm and neutral. "I would rather not interrupt your lesson," Daeho said politely. "Please continue with what you were teaching." But Veltar was not ready to let this chance go. He had a classroom full of students watching, and he wanted to make sure they understood the difference between advanced species like his own and primitive ones like the humans. This quiet, disrespectful student was perfect for demonstrating that difference. The stage was set for what Veltar thought would be an easy demonstration of human limitations. He had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his academic career. Professor Veltar felt very pleased with himself as he looked down at the quiet human student. Daeho had tried to avoid the conversation, but that just proved the professor's point even more. Primitive species always tried to hide their lack of knowledge when faced with superior intellects. Now was the perfect time to show the entire class what happened when less developed beings tried to study alongside their betters. Veltar moved back to the front of the classroom and activated his holographic display system. Bright images filled the air above the students, showing detailed pictures of Earth and its technology. He had prepared these images specifically for this moment, choosing the most basic and primitive examples he could find. "Class, let us examine the current state of human technology," Veltar announced with obvious satisfaction. "These images come from their home planet, which they call Earth. Notice the crude nature of their transportation systems. The holograms showed cars moving on roads, trains running on metal tracks, and airplanes flying through the atmosphere. To the alien students who came from worlds with floating cities and teleportation networks, these Earth vehicles looked incredibly old-fashioned and slow. They still burn fossil fuels, ancient organic matter, to power most of their machines." Veltar continued, his four eyes gleaming with amusement. "Can you imagine? In an age when civilized species harness the power of stars and quantum fields, humans are still digging chemicals out of the ground and setting them on fire." Several students made sounds of disbelief. A tall blue student with 6 arms raised one hand and asked, "Professor, do they not have any clean energy sources?" Veltar smiled, showing his sharp teeth. They are experimenting with what they call solar panels and wind turbines. Very basic attempts to use their star's energy, but extremely inefficient compared to our fusion reactors and zero-point energy collectors. The holographic display changed to show human rockets launching from Earth. The massive vehicles created huge clouds of fire and smoke as they lifted off, looking violent and wasteful compared to the silent, elegant spacecraft the aliens were used to. "And here we see their space program," Veltar said with mock admiration. "These chemical rockets can barely escape their planet's gravity well. Most of their launches fail, and the ones that succeed can only carry tiny amounts of cargo. They celebrate reaching their own moon, as if it were a great achievement." More students began to look at the three humans in the class with what seemed like pity. So Young and Minho looked very embarrassed and uncomfortable. They had known they would face some prejudice studying among advanced alien species, but this public humiliation was worse than they had expected. Dae-ho, however, seemed completely unbothered by the professor's attacks. He had taken out his notebook again and was writing more equations. His pencil moved steadily across the paper as he worked on calculations that appeared very complex. Sometimes he would pause to think, then continue writing with renewed focus. Veltar noticed that the human was not paying attention to the lecture about his own species' failures. This made the professor even more determined to get a reaction. He walked closer to Dae-ho's desk while continuing his presentation. "The humans have been attempting space travel for nearly a century now," Veltar said, his voice growing louder. "In all that time, they have managed to send exactly 12 of their people to their moon. 12. Some of our species send more than that on routine cargo runs." The comparison was devastating. Students from worlds that moved millions of people between planets every day could hardly believe that humans found it difficult to reach their own natural satellite. "But perhaps," Veltar continued, moving even closer to Dae-ho, "our human student can enlighten us about his species' plans for future development. Surely someone studying at our advanced institution must have insights into how humanity hopes to catch up with the rest of the galaxy." Dae-ho looked up from his notebook with an expression of mild confusion, as if he had just noticed the professor was talking to him. This casual attitude made several alien students gasp quietly. No one ignored Professor Veltar during his lectures, especially not students from primitive species. "I'm sorry," Dae-ho said politely. "Were you asking me something specific?" Veltar's mandibles clicked together in annoyance. The human's relaxed manner was either incredible stupidity or outrageous disrespect. Either way, it provided an excellent opportunity to demonstrate proper behavior to the rest of the class. "I was asking about your species' future plans for space development," Veltar repeated slowly as if talking to a small child. "Surely even humans must have some ideas about how to improve their primitive technology." Dae-ho glanced around the classroom, seeming to notice for the first time that everyone was staring at him. So Young and Minho looked mortified, while the alien students watched with fascination to see how this confrontation would develop. "We have some projects in development," Dae-ho said simply. "Nothing too exciting yet." This answer made Veltar feel even more confident. The human was clearly out of his depth and trying to avoid admitting his ignorance. Perfect for the lesson Veltar wanted to teach. "Nothing too exciting?" Veltar repeated with obvious sarcasm. "Come now, Mr. Kim, surely you can share some details. With students who have mastered interstellar travel for thousands of years, what are these mysterious projects?" The holographic display changed again to show images of advanced alien spacecraft. These ships looked like works of art compared to human rockets, with smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to bend light itself. They moved through space without any visible propulsion, appearing and disappearing as they folded space-time around themselves. "For comparison," Veltar said, gesturing at the beautiful alien vessels, "these are examples of mature space technology. Ships that can cross the galaxy in days, carry entire cities worth of passengers, and reshape matter at the quantum level. This is what real space travel looks like." Dae-ho looked at the holograms with what seemed like genuine interest. He studied the alien ships carefully, occasionally making small notes in his notebook. His attention to the technical details was more intense than anything he had shown for the professor's lecture. "The propulsion systems look very elegant," Dae-ho commented. Are those quantum tunnel drives? Veltar was surprised by the question. He had not expected the human to recognize advanced technology, much less ask informed questions about it. But he quickly decided this was just the human repeating words he had heard without understanding their meaning. Yes, they are quantum tunnel drives, Veltar answered condescendingly, though I doubt you could comprehend the principles involved. The mathematics alone require understanding of 11-dimensional space-time topology. That does sound complex, Deho agreed mildly. The stability equations must be incredibly difficult to solve. Several alien students nodded in agreement. Even their advanced species found quantum tunnel mathematics challenging. The fact that a human was asking about it seemed almost amusing. Veltar felt completely in control of the situation now. The human was asking questions that proved how little he understood, making Veltar's point about primitive species even more effectively than planned. Indeed they are, Veltar said with exaggerated patience. These are concepts that even our most advanced students struggle with. Perhaps you should focus on understanding your own species' simple chemical rockets before attempting to grasp such sophisticated technology. The insult was clear and deliberate. Several students looked uncomfortable with how harsh the professor was being, but none dared to speak up. Veltar had a reputation for being cruel to students who challenged him, and everyone knew it was best not to get involved. Deho nodded as if he agreed with the professor's suggestion. You're probably right, he said. I should stick to simpler things. He returned to his notebook and continued working on his equations. The calm way he accepted the insult made some students respect him, while others thought it proved he really was not very intelligent. Veltar felt triumphant. He had successfully demonstrated the proper relationship between advanced and primitive species, and the human had accepted his place without causing trouble. The lesson was proceeding exactly as planned. Professor Veltar walked back to the front of the classroom feeling very satisfied with how his demonstration was going. The human student had been properly put in his place, and the rest of the class had learned an important lesson about the natural order between advanced and primitive species. Now he could continue with his prepared lecture about integration protocols. But as Veltar began setting up his next holographic display, he noticed that Deho had raised his hand. This was the first time the human had voluntarily participated in any class discussion since arriving at the station 3 weeks ago. The sudden change surprised Veltar, but he decided it might provide another opportunity to demonstrate human limitations. Yes, Mr. Kim? Veltar said with barely concealed amusement. Do you have a question about chemical rocket technology? Deho put his hand down and looked directly at the professor. His expression was still calm and polite, but there seemed to be something different in his dark eyes, a sharpness that had not been there before. Actually, I was wondering if you could tell us more about how your quantum tunnel drives work, Deho said in his quiet voice. I'm curious about the technical details. Several alien students turned to look at Deho with surprise. Even asking such a question seemed bold for someone from such a primitive species. Veltar's 4 eyes narrowed as he tried to determine what the human was attempting to do. The technical details would be far beyond your comprehension, Veltar replied with a condescending smile. These systems operate on principles that require decades of advanced study to understand. I'm sure you're right, Deho agreed easily. But could you maybe explain it in simple terms? Just the basic concept? Veltar felt pleased. The human was admitting his intellectual limitations and asking for help understanding superior technology. This was exactly the kind of humble behavior primitive species should display when learning from their betters. Very well, Veltar said grandly. I shall attempt to explain quantum tunnel propulsion in terms even a human can grasp. The professor activated a new holographic display that showed a simplified diagram of a tunnel drive system. Bright lines of energy curved through space connecting 2 points that seemed very far apart. The basic principle, Veltar began in a voice like he was speaking to a child, involves creating artificial tunnels through the fabric of space-time itself. We manipulate quantum fields to essentially fold the universe, allowing ships to travel vast distances instantaneously. Deho nodded thoughtfully and took some notes. So you're creating wormholes? In the most basic sense, yes, Veltar answered, though calling them mere wormholes vastly understates the complexity involved. We must solve differential equations in 11 dimensions while accounting for quantum uncertainty and relativistic effects. That does sound very complicated, Deho said. How do you keep the tunnels stable? I imagine they would want to collapse almost immediately. Veltar paused for a moment. The question showed more understanding than he had expected from a human, but he decided the student must have heard similar discussions before, and was simply repeating technical terms without really understanding them. Tunnel stability is maintained through exotic matter injection, Veltar explained. We use negative energy density fields to counteract the natural tendency toward collapse. The calculations require constant real-time adjustments as the ship moves through the tunnel. Deho made more notes in his notebook. Negative energy density. That's interesting. You must need enormous amounts of computational power to handle all those calculations simultaneously. Indeed, Veltar said, becoming more confident again. Our quantum computers process millions of variables every microsecond. It is technology far beyond anything your species has even dreamed of creating. But instead of looking impressed or defeated by this information, Deho seemed genuinely fascinated. His pencil moved quickly across the paper as he wrote down what appeared to be complex mathematical formulas. Occasionally, he would pause, stare at his work with intense concentration, then continue writing. Professor, Deho said after a few minutes, could I ask about the energy requirements? Creating negative energy fields must consume incredible amounts of power. Veltar felt a small flicker of uncertainty. The human's questions were becoming surprisingly specific and technical, but surely this was just curiosity from someone who did not really understand what he was asking about. The energy requirements are substantial, Veltar admitted. Each tunnel requires the output equivalent to a small star. We harvest this energy through controlled fusion reactions and zero-point field manipulation. Deho looked up from his notebook with interest. Zero-point field manipulation? That's extracting energy from quantum vacuum fluctuations, right? Now several alien students were staring at Deho with confusion. Even they found zero-point physics difficult to understand, and most had been studying advanced science for years. How was a human from a primitive species asking such informed questions? Veltar's confidence began to waver slightly. Yes, that is correct. Though I am surprised you are familiar with the terminology. Oh, we've been looking into similar concepts back home, Deho said casually. Nothing as advanced as what you've achieved, of course. We're still working out some of the basic theory. The way Deho said "we" made Veltar pause. It suggested that the human was personally involved in advanced research, which seemed impossible given Earth's primitive technology level. Veltar decided the human must be exaggerating his involvement or misunderstanding what real research meant. I see, Veltar said with renewed condescension. And what sort of research do humans conduct into such advanced topics? Deho seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. Well, we've been working on the mathematical foundations mostly, trying to solve some of the stability problems that seem to plague artificial wormhole creation. Stability problems? Veltar repeated, his voice rising slightly. What makes you think there are stability problems with our technology? Oh, I'm sure your systems work perfectly, Deho said quickly. I was just thinking about the theoretical limitations. Even the most advanced tunnel drives must lose some energy through dimensional bleed-off, right? The question hit Veltar like a physical blow. Dimensional bleed-off was indeed the primary limitation of tunnel drive technology, causing energy losses that required constant compensation. It was one of the most closely guarded secrets of advanced spacefaring civilizations, and definitely not something a primitive human should know about. How do you know about dimensional bleed-off? Veltar demanded, his earlier confidence completely gone. Deho looked genuinely surprised by the professor's sharp tone. I'm sorry if I said something wrong. I was just guessing based on the physics involved. If you're manipulating 11-dimensional space, there would naturally be energy leakage into unused dimensions. The casual way Deho explained one of the most complex problems in advanced physics made several students gasp audibly. Even Veltar, who had studied tunnel mechanics for decades, found the human's intuitive understanding disturbing. That is a reasonable assumption, Veltar said slowly, trying to regain his composure. But I am curious how someone from such a primitive world would even think to consider such possibilities. Deho shrugged. Math is math, regardless of which planet you're from. The universe follows the same rules everywhere. This simple statement carried implications that made Veltar deeply uncomfortable. If the human was right, if mathematical principles really were universal, then advanced technology might not be as impossible for primitive species as Veltar had always believed. Besides, Deho continued, returning to his notebook, we've been thinking about ways to minimize dimensional bleed-off in our theoretical models. There might be some elegant solutions if you approach the problem from a different angle. Veltar stared at the quiet human student with growing alarm. What had started as a simple demonstration of primitive intellectual limitations was turning into something much more dangerous. A challenge to everything Veltar thought he knew about the natural order of species development. The classroom had become completely silent except for the soft humming of the station's systems. Every student was staring at Deho with expressions ranging from confusion to amazement. Professor Veltar stood frozen at the front of the room, his 4 eyes fixed on the human who had just casually mentioned solving problems that had puzzled advanced civilizations for centuries. Veltar tried to collect his thoughts and regain control of the situation. Surely the human was just making lucky guesses or repeating things he had heard without understanding them. There was no way a primitive species could actually contribute meaningful insights to advanced physics. Mr. Kim, Veltar said, his voice more strained than before. You mentioned theoretical models for minimizing dimensional bleed-off. I am curious what sort of models a human might devise for such complex problems. Deho looked up from his notebook with that same mild expression he always wore. Would you really want to hear about it? I don't want to take up class time with amateur theories. The false modesty in Deho's voice made several alien students lean forward with interest. They had begun to realize that this quiet human might be more than he appeared to be. Even So Young and Minho were staring at their fellow human with shock and growing excitement. Please, by all means, share your amateur theories, Veltar said with heavy sarcasm. I am sure the class would find them educational. Deho hesitated for a moment, then closed his notebook and stood up. Well, if you insist, but I'll need to use your holographic projector to show the math properly. The request stunned everyone in the room. No student had ever asked to take over a professor's equipment during a lecture, especially not a student from a primitive species. Veltar found himself agreeing before he fully realized what he was doing. Very well, Veltar said, stepping aside. Please demonstrate your human insights into quantum tunnel mechanics. Deho walked calmly to the front of the classroom, carrying his notebook. He examined the holographic projection system for a moment, then began entering commands with surprising familiarity. Within seconds, his notebook drawings appeared as three-dimensional mathematical models floating in the air above the students. The equations that materialized were unlike anything most of the students had seen before. They were elegant and complex, filled with symbols and relationships that seemed to dance through multiple dimensions. Even the advanced alien students found themselves straining to follow the mathematical logic. The basic problem with current tunnel drive technology, Deho began in his quiet voice, is that you're fighting against the natural curvature of space-time instead of working with it. He manipulated the holographic display to show how existing tunnel drives created artificial pathways through space. The energy patterns looked forced and unstable, requiring constant power to maintain their shape. See how the energy fields are oriented perpendicular to the dimensional substrate? Deho pointed to specific areas of the model. This creates massive resistance and forces you to pump enormous amounts of power into the system just to keep it from collapsing. Veltar stared at the display with growing disbelief. The human was not just repeating technical terms. He was demonstrating deep understanding of the most advanced physics known to galactic civilization. But what if you aligned the tunnel matrix with the natural quantum foam patterns instead? Deho continued, modifying the equations in real time. You could actually use the universe's existing structure to help stabilize the wormhole. The new model that appeared was breathtaking in its elegance. Instead of fighting against natural forces, it seemed to flow with them, creating stable pathways that required a fraction of the energy used by traditional systems. A student near the front, Hyejin Nam from Centaurus, raised one of her tentacles nervously. But wouldn't that approach destabilize the quantum matrix? The interference patterns alone would be impossible to control. Daeho smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since arriving at the station. That's exactly what we thought at first. But if you introduce a recursive feedback loop here, he highlighted a section of the equations, the interference patterns actually help stabilize the system instead of destroying it. The mathematical proof that followed was so elegant that several students gasped audibly. Daeho was showing them how to turn the biggest weakness of tunnel drive technology into its greatest strength. The beautiful thing about this approach, Daeho continued, warming to his subject, is that it becomes more efficient as you scale it up. Longer tunnels actually require less energy per unit distance than shorter ones. Professor Veltar felt the blood draining from his face as he realized the implications. If the humans' calculations were correct, they represented a revolution in space travel that would make every existing ship in the galaxy obsolete overnight. Mr. Kim, Veltar said weakly, where exactly did you learn about quantum tunnel mechanics? Daeho looked surprised by the question. I'm a theoretical physicist. This is what I do for a living. The simple statement sent shockwaves through the classroom. A theoretical physicist, not a student, but a professional researcher who had come to study at their academy. What kind of theoretical physicist? Asked Tae-young Jung, an Andromedan student whose species was known for their scientific achievements. I specialize in quantum mechanics and space-time manipulation, Daeho replied. I lead the FTL development program back on Earth. The silence that followed was so complete that the station's life support system seemed loud by comparison. Every being in the room stared at Daeho with expressions of shock and disbelief. FTL development program? Veltar repeated in a strangled voice. Yes, Daeho said, seeming confused by everyone's reaction. We've been working on practical faster-than-light travel for about 15 years now. I came here to see how other species solve similar problems and to make sure our approach would be compatible with existing galactic infrastructure. He gestured at his holographic display. The efficiency improvements I just showed you are actually based on our current prototype design. We've been testing it in computer simulations for the past 2 years. Min-Ho Lee finally found his voice. Daeho, are you saying that humans are about to achieve FTL travel? Not about to, Daeho corrected gently. We're planning our first test flight next month. Just a quick hop to Alpha Centauri and back to make sure everything works properly. The revelation hit the classroom like a physical force. Humans, primitive, backward humans, who supposedly could barely reach their own moon, were 1 month away from their first interstellar voyage. But that's impossible, whispered another student. Your species doesn't even have fusion power. Daeho tilted his head thoughtfully. We don't need fusion power for our drive system. That's part of what makes our approach different from traditional tunnel drives. We found a way to extract energy directly from quantum vacuum fluctuations with much greater efficiency. Professor Veltar realized with growing horror that everything he thought he knew about human capabilities was completely wrong. For weeks he had been lecturing about primitive species integration to the very scientist who was about to make humanity a major spacefaring power. The modifications I just showed you, Daeho continued, unaware of the chaos his words were creating, would improve your existing ships by about 40%. Though I should mention that our human designs will probably be quite a bit faster than anything currently in service. As the full implications of what they were hearing began to sink in, the alien students started asking excited questions all at once. They wanted to know about human research methods, their theoretical frameworks, their testing procedures, and dozens of other technical details. Daeho answered each question with the casual expertise of someone who had spent years working on these problems. His quiet manner and simple explanations made even the most complex concepts seem straightforward and logical. Professor Veltar watched in stunned silence as his carefully planned lesson about primitive species turned into an impromptu seminar on revolutionary space travel technology, taught by the very human he had intended to humiliate. The questions from excited students kept coming faster than Daeho could answer them. Beings from a dozen different worlds wanted to know about human research methods, theoretical approaches, and technical specifications. The quiet human who had been ignored and mocked for weeks suddenly found himself at the center of the most animated scientific discussion the classroom had ever seen. Daeho handled each question with patient expertise, explaining complex concepts in simple terms that everyone could understand. His calm manner made even the most revolutionary ideas seem logical and straightforward. The holographic display above the students continued to show his elegant mathematical proofs, each equation more impressive than the last. Professor Veltar stood at the side of his own classroom feeling completely lost. Everything he had believed about the natural order of species development was crumbling around him. The primitive human he had planned to humiliate was casually revolutionizing the most advanced technology in known space. "Dr. Kim," said Heejin Nam, using the proper title for the first time, "how long have humans been working on FTL theory?" "Please just call me Daeho," he replied with a smile. "We've been serious about it for about 20 years, but the real breakthrough came 5 years ago, when we figured out how to stabilize the quantum vacuum extraction process." Another student asked, "What made you think to try vacuum extraction instead of traditional power sources?" Daeho paused to think about the question. "Well, we didn't have traditional power sources available. No fusion reactors, no zero-point collectors, none of the infrastructure other species use. We had to find a different approach or give up entirely." The simple honesty of his answer struck everyone in the room. Humanity's lack of advanced technology had not held them back. It had forced them to find better solutions that more advanced species had never considered. "Sometimes limitations force creativity," Daeho continued. "When you can't do something the established way, you have to invent entirely new methods." So Young Park finally spoke up, her voice filled with wonder. "Daeho, why didn't you tell us who you were when you arrived?" Daeho looked genuinely confused by the question. "I thought everyone knew. I'm here as part of the cultural exchange program. I assumed my background was in the admission records." Professor Veltar realized with mounting embarrassment that he had never bothered to read the human student's file carefully. He had seen Earth and human and assumed the being was just another primitive trying to learn from superior species. The idea that a human might actually contribute to galactic knowledge had never crossed his mind. "What exactly is your position back on Earth?" Veltar asked, dreading the answer. "I'm the director of theoretical physics for the United Earth Space Agency," Daeho replied matter-of-factly. "I lead the team that designed our FTL drive system." The title sent another wave of shock through the room. Director of Theoretical Physics. That was equivalent to the highest scientific positions in the most advanced civilizations. And this being had been sitting quietly in the back of their classroom for 3 weeks, while Veltar lectured about primitive species. Tae-Young Jung asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Dr. Kim, if humans are so close to achieving FTL travel, why did you come here to study with us?" Daeho's answer was characteristically modest. "Because you've all been doing this for thousands of years longer than we have. I wanted to learn about your approaches, see what problems you'd encountered, and make sure our systems would work properly with existing galactic infrastructure." He gestured at the holographic display still showing his revolutionary equations. "Plus, I hoped I might be able to share some of our ideas in return. Scientific progress works best when everyone contributes what they can." The generous spirit behind his words impressed everyone in the room. Despite being far ahead of established technology, Daeho had come as a humble student ready to learn from others and share his own knowledge freely. "The efficiency improvements you showed us," said another student. "You're just giving those away?" "Of course," Daeho replied, looking surprised by the question. "Knowledge belongs to everyone. The universe is big enough for all of us to explore together." This attitude was completely foreign to most of the alien students, who came from cultures where technological advantages were closely guarded secrets. The idea that humans would freely share revolutionary discoveries seemed almost incomprehensible. Professor Veltar found his voice again. though it came out as barely a whisper. "Dr. Kim, the test flight you mentioned, when exactly is it scheduled?" 3 weeks from today, Daeho answered. "We're calling it the Horizon mission. Just a quick trip to Proxima Centauri to validate our calculations and test all systems under real conditions." The date hit Veltar like a physical blow. In 3 weeks, everything would change. Humanity would join the ranks of spacefaring civilizations, and they would do it with technology superior to anything currently in use. "What happens after the test flight?" asked Minho, speaking for all the humans in the room. Daeho's expression grew more serious. "If everything goes well, we'll begin construction of a full exploration fleet. Earth's government has approved missions to dozens of nearby star systems over the next 5 years." He paused, looking around at all the fascinated faces watching him. "That's actually another reason I'm here. We'll need to establish diplomatic relations with existing galactic civilizations. We want to be good neighbors, not disruptive newcomers." The thoughtfulness behind this statement impressed everyone present. Humans were not just developing superior technology. They were already planning how to integrate responsibly with the broader galactic community. As the questions continued, Professor Veltar slowly began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had spent his entire career teaching that species development followed predictable patterns, with advanced races naturally superior to primitive ones. The quiet human sitting in his classroom had shattered that worldview completely. When the IAD class period finally ended, students crowded around Daeho asking for copies of his equations and contact information for future collaboration. The being who had been ignored and mocked 3 hours earlier was now the most sought-after person on the station. Daeho answered every question patiently and gave freely of his knowledge. He handed out printed copies of his calculations and promised to share more detailed research when he returned to Earth. As students began filing out of the room, still buzzing with excitement about what they had learned, Daeho packed up his notebook and prepared to leave. He paused at the doorway and looked back at Professor Veltar, who stood alone at the front of his classroom looking stunned and defeated. "Professor Veltar," Daeho said quietly, "thank you for a very educational class. I learned a lot about how other species approach these problems." There was no sarcasm or mockery in his voice, just genuine appreciation. Despite being publicly humiliated for hours, Daeho bore no resentment toward the professor who had tried to use him as an example of primitive ignorance. "I hope our test flight goes well," Daeho continued. "If it does, maybe we can arrange for some of your students to visit Earth and see our research facilities. I think there's a lot we could learn from each other." The generous offer left Veltar speechless. After everything that had happened, the human was still willing to share knowledge and build bridges between their species. As Daeho walked away, Veltar noticed he had left something on the podium. It was a handwritten note attached to several pages of detailed mathematical proofs and engineering specifications. The note read, "Professor Veltar, these are the complete technical specifications for our FTL drive system, including manufacturing details and operational protocols. Consider it a gift from humanity to the galactic academic community. We hope it will help everyone explore the universe together. Thank you for inspiring me to think about these problems from new angles. Daeho Kim, Director of Theoretical Physics, United Earth Space Agency." Professor Veltar stared at the papers in his trembling hands, realizing that he held the most valuable technical document in galactic history. The human he had tried to humiliate had responded with the greatest gift imaginable, the key to revolutionizing space travel for every civilization in the galaxy. In that moment, Veltar finally understood what he had learned that day. It was not a lesson about primitive species or proper academic hierarchy. It was a lesson about the dangerous arrogance of assuming superiority and the incredible generosity of those who choose knowledge sharing over knowledge hoarding. Humanity had announced its arrival on the galactic stage not with conquest or demands for recognition, but with quiet competence and open-handed friendship. And Professor Veltar had been privileged to witness the beginning of a new era in galactic civilization, even if he had been too blind to recognize it until it was almost too late.